All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar event. We are so happy that you all could join us today. It is my great pleasure to introduce Sari Mazon. She is a special education advocate with nearly 2 decades of special education experience. Sari is a licensed special education teacher, child of a parent with disabilities, former foster child, adoptive foster parent, person with a disability, and a parent of children with disabilities. She uses those experiences in her private practice as a special education advocate to empower parents and caregivers to advocate for the needs of their students through caregiver education, training, and support. In addition to working with parents and caregivers, Sari partners with community agencies to provide education and training for individuals who work with people with disabilities, such as early intervention providers, foster care social workers, disability advocates, and others. Diversity, equity, inclusion, and intersectionality are the foundations of Sari's advocacy and teaching methods. She emphasizes the importance of recognizing, acknowledging, and challenging the systems of discrimination and oppression that harm groups of individuals based on race, gender, sex, disability, religion, ethnicity, age, marital status, political affiliation, etc. Sari is also a Drexel Dragon that will complete the postgraduate certificate in collaborative special education law and process this week.
All right. Well, thank you for that. Welcome, Erica. I really appreciate that. It's definitely odd when you hear somebody else talk about you in that way, but I really appreciate it. So, and thank you for having me. Thank you for this opportunity to speak about this really important topic today. I'm really glad that everyone could be here, and I hope that everybody is able to either learn something today that they can use immediately, or learn something today that they weren't sure about, but now it's kind of confirmed what they knew. So that's really my goal for today, is that you take something away from today. We're going to talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504. So we're going to use some acronyms, and I'll try to make sure that I'm explaining them as they go. That can sometimes be tricky as I get caught up in acronyms that I'm familiar with. So I'll try to be careful about that kind of as we go. And so somebody will be monitoring the chat. If you have questions, please feel free to put those in the chat if they are appropriate or relevant to the topic that I'm currently discussing. I'll try to answer them at the moment. If not, I will answer those questions at the end. And it's likely that we'll have time at the end for kind of Q&As as well, just questions that you may have that you hadn't thought about or that you kind of held on to. Are you ready, Hassan? So, again, thank you, Erica, for that introduction. So there are lots of things about me. I've been, interacting with the world of individuals with disability for my entire life in one capacity or another. So I'm really hoping that that experience kind of shows through, and that my passion for this is evident and supports others in their learning. And I am going to include this shameless plug for the Collaborative Special Education Law Process Postgraduate Certificate. So obviously you can find this information on the Drexel website about what this class is, but it's for graduate level classes in collaborative special education law and process. And it's geared towards special ed teachers, administrators, parents, and special education advocates that are wanting to really focus on that collaborative piece. So how to create that school, family, community. And really, that is, when we look at the law and the way the law was redefined, that really is the goal, is to create that collaborative process so that everybody is an equal part and everybody is included. So it really is an ambitious goal, but it is the way the law is written, and it is the most beneficial process for students with disabilities. So this is a great program. I've really enjoyed my time in the program. So thank you to Dr. Little and the other instructors in the program. But that's my shameless plug for that. I do want to just kind of add a disclaimer. We are talking about legal topics. We're talking about the law around special education and the law around individuals with disabilities. So I want to make it very clear, I am not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. If you need legal advice, you should always consult a licensed attorney for any legal needs you have. So I just want to make sure that's very clear. Any questions that are had about the law, I'll be sure to answer to the best of my ability, to my knowledge. But again, I cannot provide legal advice, and I am not providing legal advice. So the objectives for this this training is to familiarize you with the Rehabilitation Act, Section 504, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which was known as the EHA, and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is most popularly known as IDEA or IDEA. You'll hear those kind of hand in hand. I want to make sure that you understand the historical significance of the Rehabilitation Act, Section 504. Understand the differences between IDEA and Section 504. And identify the purposes of IDEA transition planning. So we're going to talk about what that looks like. I want to make sure that you're able to define disability and review the qualifications under Section 504. So what that means and how do you know if you qualify? I want to provide you with information on how you can access Section 504 supports in post-secondary education institutions. And then define and identify a reasonable accommodation. So what is a reasonable accommodation? How do you know if you need one? How do you get one? I'm going to talk also about Schedule A hiring pretty briefly, but I want to make sure that it's at least mentioned. And then I want to talk about methods of dispute resolution. So again, not legal advice, but just some information on where you can go if you need to resolve a dispute. So which came first? I briefly mentioned chickens, my love of chickens before we started this, when we were kind of chatting before everybody else joined us. So hence the chicken joke. But I was here first. So which came first? And we're not talking about chickens and eggs, but we are talking about IDEA and ADA. So Americans with Disabilities Act and Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Which one came first? And so when we look at legislation, really, the Rehabilitation Act, Section 504, was written into law in 1973. And so, of course, the processes started before that because it takes a long time to write something into law and have it actually enacted. So we know that went into law in 1973. And then in 1975, the Educations for All Handicapped Children Act, or EHA, followed. And really the Rehabilitation Act, or Section 504, and for the remainder of this, I'm going to just refer to it as Section 504. It's a mouthful otherwise. So when I say Section 504, that's what I'm referring to. But EHA came out of the labor of the civil rights activists for disability rights in Section 504. And so it really acknowledged that children with disabilities were not being provided an education, that there weren't programs to meet the needs of students with disabilities. And EHA required that there were programs. We had to meet the needs. And some of the pieces of the foundation that we still use were put in place then. So procedures for evaluations, the term free and appropriate public education, the term individualized education program, and grievance procedures. Now, they don't look today exactly like they looked then. Things have been developed and things have been modified. And so But this was the foundation, and that foundation came out of Section 504. In 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, what became the new foundation of the law. And so that was built from Section 504 and was developed into the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so the Rehabilitation Act only applied to programs that receive federal funding. The Americans with Disabilities Act looks at all programs. And so all businesses, private, public, federally funded, not funded, in all arenas of life. There are very few areas where ADA doesn't currently touch, and very, very few. And so it's important that we understand kind of where those foundations came from. So when we're talking about that, we know whence we came, so we know where we're going, as there still is room, definitely room to grow, and things that still need to change. And so that same year in 1990, the IDEA was passed and brought into law. That was reauthorized in 2004 with some minor but impactful changes. So again, it is constantly changing and evolving, but essentially the foundations are the same. And so IDEA gave us least restrictive environment. It redefined what comprehensive evaluations look like. It really focused on that collaborative piece of making sure that families, parents, caregivers, et cetera, were a part of that process. It also gave us some procedural safeguards. So really defined what rights parents and caregivers and students had when it came to accessing a free and appropriate public education. So just understanding kind of those foundational pieces. Let's talk about exactly more in depth kind of what those pieces are. And we aren't going to spend a lot of time on IDEA today, just because we're really going to be talking about that public school, that K-12 to post-secondary education and the workforce transition. So now, sometimes prior to being out of K-12, people will be in the workforce and still need reasonable accommodations, and that's perfectly applicable here, just in the general sense. We're going to be talking mostly about Section 504 ADA and in that sense. So the foundation of Section 504 gave us mandatory special education services. So it said that students with disabilities have to be educated. It's not optional. Prior to this, it was something that schools could choose to do or not choose to do. It gave us the prohibition of discrimination based on disability. Really powerful information as far as that goes. Just making sure that there's actually legal foundation in place for that prohibition of discrimination based on disability. And this was founded largely out of the civil rights movement. So the civil rights movement was making an argument for prohibition of discrimination based on race, and disability advocates said, well, they can do that, then, based on race, that inalienable characteristic that can't be changed, then we can most certainly do that based on disability. And so really that's where that came from, that foundation, that civil rights advocacy foundation. And again, Section 504 requires that if an agency is receiving federal funds, they must comply with anti-discrimination policy. This picture is very impactful, especially now. Judy Heumann, who is the center, the yellow socks in the middle, was a significant figure in the disability rights advocacy movement, and she recently passed. So I believe it was at the beginning of this month. I think it was March 3rd. And so there's a great documentary that features her on Netflix, if that's something you're interested in. And I don't work for Netflix, just indicating that it was very powerful. It's called Crip Camp, if you have any interest in that. And so some more information on that Section 504. So one of the biggest components of that was recognizing students with disabilities as people with disabilities. And when I say that out loud, it sounds kind of funny because, well, of course they're people, but so many people with disabilities were not recognized as people. They were recognized as their disability. They were seen as less than people. And we do still face this kind of stigma or discrimination today, albeit not as significantly as in the 1970s. And that's due largely to the advocacy work that was done by disability advocates, excuse me. And so out of Section 504, we got the terms reasonable modification and reasonable accommodation. And those are the foundation for disability education or anti-discrimination and education of individuals with disabilities. We're going to talk about exactly what those mean and what that looks like. It also gave us the definition or terminology of undue burden. And so we're going to talk also about what undue burden means. Some background on the sign. Part of the advocacy movement that was going on was a sit-in in California, one of the longest sit-ins in US history, lasted more than 25 days. That is also mentioned in that documentary that I previously mentioned. So if that is something that you are interested in or want to know more about, again, it's a great documentary. Feel free to take a look at that. And so out of Section 504, so 1973 to 1990, math isn't my favorite nor my strongest subject. How many years is that? 27? But so out of that Section 504 came a need for some more interventions, some more legal protections. And so we were developing legal protections in school for students with disabilities, but it wasn't reaching all areas of life. It wasn't providing access in all schools. It wasn't providing access in employment. It wasn't providing access to public transportation or methods of public transportation. Things like ramps and curb cuts and access to low vision reading materials or signage like Braille or large print, things like automatic doors, chairlifts, elevators, all those things that make life accessible for individuals with disabilities, they weren't required, they were optional. And so Americans with Disabilities Act made them required. It also made it a requirement outside of just agencies that were receiving federal funds. It made it a requirement for all agencies. And so it was really, really important to acknowledge and for this law to be passed and give some additional protections. And I always say, yes, it was great work. However, there's still work to be done. And so it's important that we continue to do the work. One of the things that Erica mentioned in my bio was the concept of intersectionality. So if you're unfamiliar with the concept of intersectionality, Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw developed this concept, or coined this word, defined this word, this framework of intersectionality. And it talks about how the different components of our identities really define who we are and how they overlap and how they intersect to determine how we interact with the world and how we interact with others in the world. And so those overlapping identities can, be subject to overlapping discrimination. And so where it's difficult is identifying how one piece of your identity versus another piece of your identity is the root cause of discrimination or the basis of that discrimination that's being experienced. And so having a disability is, of course, one part of an individual's identity, but there are so many other pieces of that identity. And that goes back to that piece of people with disabilities. They are people first, and have so many other parts of, or we are people first, and have so many other parts of our identity that we want noticed or identified prior to just being recognized for disability. But sometimes it can be challenging to identify am I facing discrimination? Am I experiencing discrimination because I have a disability, or because I'm Jewish, or because I'm a member of the LGBTQ plus community, or because I speak a different language, or because of my ethnicity, or because of my religion, or because of who I'm married to, or because I'm not married, or because I don't have children, or because I do have children. It can be really challenging to separate those parts of your identity. So intersectionality is an incredibly important part of advocacy work, regardless of the group that you are advocating for. And that leads me to the piece that when we are advocating, it is essential, it is critical that we are listening to the voices of those that we are advocating for, that we are looking at the identities of those that we intend to advocate for, and make sure that those identities are reflected in the work we do with advocacy. Are we reflecting the voices of those that we're trying to advocate for? Otherwise, it's not true advocacy, and we have to be incredibly mindful of that. And so that means interacting with the individuals that we are advocating for, the individuals in that community, asking others about their identity, learning about their identity, whether it's their culture or their race or their religion or their gender or their sexuality or their marital or parenting status, etc. But making sure that we are listening and we are mindful of the voices that we are intending to advocate for. So I won't spend a lot of time on that, but I hope that you see that theme throughout any type of presentation or training or conversation that you have with me. I hope that that's something that you feel and you receive when you're doing any type of learning. And I hope that you're able to utilize that and include that in any kind of advocacy work or sharing that you do with others. All right, so let's talk about IDEA versus Section 504. And there's going to be a lot of information here. I don't expect that all of it is going to be remembered or retained, but I just kind of want to give you a general idea of kind of what the differences are. And again, we're going to talk more about Section 504, but it is really important that you kind of know what both pieces are. And so one of the largest differences is in that piece of defining a disability. So IDEA has very specific definitions for disability. There are specific disability categories that you must qualify under to qualify for IDEA. They're very specific. Each one is laid out. Each one has qualifications. And some of the ones they include are specific learning disability, orthopedic impairment. And I'm not going to list them all just for sake of time. If there are questions about that individually afterwards, I'd be happy to answer them. But with a 504, really the definition changes. It's more of a broad class definition. And we're going to go into that in depth about kind of what that definition is. But it's definitely more of a broad class definition. So there are less parameters, it's less strict, it's more encompassing of all types of disabilities and multiple impacts that disability can have. And so one of the other pieces for both is evaluation. So how eligibility is determined. And again, IDEA has very specific parameters on how an evaluation has to be conducted, who has to conduct an evaluation, how an evaluation has to be presented. And with Section 504, it's more fluid. It's more about, do you meet the criteria for that broad class of disability, and going from there. It can include an evaluation component, but it's not necessarily required as a result of that broad class definition. Also, when we talk about service providers and teams, so who provides services, who has to be part of the process, it's quite a bit different. IDEA has very strict and specific parameters on who has to be part of a team and who can provide a service, just like with the other pieces, right? Who can do that evaluation. With 504, it really just requires a coordinator, somebody that's been identified by the agency or the school, and somebody who's familiar with the student or the person that needs the reasonable accommodation. And that can be the student as the person who needs a reasonable accommodation. The plans are quite different too. Again, IDEA has very, very strict parameters about what must be included in a plan. And the plan under IDEA is called an individualized education program, or an IEP. And in section 504, that plan is less specific, but is called a 504 plan. Very unique name there. They were very creative with that one. That was sarcasm and humor. I apologize. But it's called the 504 plan, and it retains that name whether you're in a K-12 system or you're in a post-secondary education system. Some of the other differences are around the procedural safeguards and rights, and that is because they are two separate laws. And so while one is the foundation for the other, they are two separate laws, and the laws are different. So those processes for determining rights and understanding rights are slightly different. And I'll talk a little bit more about what those kind of processes are when I talk about what dispute resolution options are available. This is not largely a rights class, but more of a understanding, defining, and access class. Also, accommodations and modifications look a little bit different, whether you're in IDEA or Section 504. So Section 504 is largely an accommodations plan. It largely talks about what accommodations are needed and to access the education or access the work environment. It can include modifications, but it's largely an accommodation plan. With IDEA, it's a number of things, but also includes accommodations and modifications. So they both have them, they just look a little bit different. And then funding. So of course, any agency that is, dealing with any of these, funding is going to be something that they think about, right? Nobody likes to do anything for free. Under IDEA, schools receive federal funding for providing IDEA or special education services. They do not receive funding for 504 services. Neither do post-secondary education institutions, and businesses that are subject to ADA, including your workplace, do not receive any kind of federal funding for complying with ADA or Section 504. So those are kind of some of the big differences there as far as what those look like. And that was a lot of information in a very short period of time. So if there are specific questions related to kind of what these differences are, or you need more information about one specific thing, again, please feel free to kind of let me know and I can answer specific questions. So this is the piece of IDEA that I said that I was going to touch on that's relevant to kind of this transition to 504 and workplace accommodations. So there are lots of really important components to IDEA, very, very essential components. However, this is the one that I'm going to focus on today because it's, like I said, most relevant to this transition piece. And so IDEA, IEP, transition planning. So transition planning is something that if you have an IEP in a K-12 system that is required by law before the student turns the age of 16. Most states will implement a transition plan around the age of 14 or when the student enters high school. Again, that's a guideline. States are allowed to do more than the federal law, but not less. So federal law says before age 16. Most will have them as soon as they enter high school, but have to have them before the student turns age 16. So some of the things that are really important to know about transition planning is that it includes the student. The student has to be a part of this process. That's a requirement. And so that student has to be invited and should be included in the process, because what we're talking about is what's next for that student. What happens after school, after that K-12 school experience for that student? Where do they go from their K-12 career? Do they go to a post-secondary institution? Do they go to a trade school? Do they go directly into the workforce? But this transition planning period is designed specifically to target that and that meet that need for students who are receiving special education services. And so goals and services that support goals are part of that plan. So we talk about goals a lot in education. So what is the student going to be able to do? And we want to identify what the student is going to be able to do, or you, if this is relevant to you. So from school to life, based on what a student wants to do, what a student is interested in, what a student has the ability to do, and what the student needs. So all of those things, right? Lots of high school students have very specific things about what they want to do, but there's also that piece of what do they need to be able to do to be independent, to be successful after their K-12 career. And so we look at three main areas when we're talking about that transition piece. So what is post-secondary education or post-secondary training? Because it could be a trade school, it could be a training program, it could be a certificate program, it could be anything. It doesn't just have to be community college or a 4-year institution. It can be a number of things. But again, so looking at those post-secondary options based on what does the student want to do? Does that student want to go to college? Does that student want to go to trade school? What type of trade are they interested in? What type of college content or core area are they interested in? Are they interested in psychology or veterinary medicine? There are lots of different, but identifying those areas. And there are lots of different interest inventories out there. Many of them are free and available online. If you're looking for an interest inventory to kind of give you some ideas about where to go with that for yourself or for a student you're working with or for a child that's maybe going through this, even if they don't have special education services. And then what abilities and needs does that student have? So what services would they need in order to access the post-secondary education institution they want to attend, or the trade school they want to attend, or the job they want to attend in the community? Maybe it's an apprenticeship-based job. But making sure that we're acknowledging both the ability level of the student and the needs of the student in order to achieve that goal. And so that's where the service piece comes in. So, right, we're talking about what the student will be able to do, but also what do they need to be able to accomplish that? And that's the job of that K-12 institution, to provide those services to meet those needs. So do they need to go on school tours? Do they need to meet with a disability resource center representative from a post-secondary institution? So from a community college or from the 4-year school or from the trade school. So do they need to meet with somebody from that? If they're wanting an apprenticeship, do they need to meet with or network with somebody that works in that trade that could maybe provide that apprenticeship training? So one of the other things the second thing that we look at is employment and independent living. So what does gainful employment look like? What does independent living look like? And again, going back to those same pieces, right? So what is the student interested in? What are the student's abilities, and what needs does the student have in order to achieve that employment or achieve that ability to live independently? And so I've worked with students in the past who, a lot of times when we think about independent living, we have a very specific picture of what that looks like, somebody with more significant needs. I've worked with a population of students in the past who were homeless or knew that they were going to need to leave their home at the age of 18 for a number of reasons. And so one of the things that we focused on when we did transition planning was independent living. And not because they didn't have or they lacked or they needed more support to live independently, but because they needed the support to figure out how to begin that transition. They didn't know how to get an apartment. They didn't know where they could rent at 18. They didn't understand things like budget and grocery shopping and those things that are required for living on your own. They knew that was coming, either because they were in foster care and they were going to age out, or because their parents' financial situation or living situation meant that when they had their 18th birthday, they'd no longer be able to be there. But there are lots of different reasons for looking at that independent living category and really providing the support and the needs there. And of course, employment. So creating those community networks around employment in areas of the student's interest and ability. So making sure that there's a match there, right? If you have a student who is interested in veterinary science, but it's likely that they're unable to go to medical school, or they're unable to complete medical school, then maybe something like veterinary technician, and you connect them with a local veterinary business to kind of facilitate that relationship, and maybe an apprenticeship and some interest in some interning or different things like that. But that's where that piece comes. So goals that the student are going to have and the services that are going to get them there to meet those goals. They have to work together and they have to set them up. Part of that transition planning is identifying, again, what's going to be needed in that follow-up. So when you're going from a K-12 system to a post-secondary institution, a higher learning institution, like a community college, a four-year institution, a trade school, you're going to need to look at transitioning from an IEP to a 504. And so they're very similar in the protections that are allowed, but it's a little bit different in the services that are provided. And so I'll talk about kind of where to get those services, but this is also a part of that piece. If a student is ending their transitioning from their K-12 career to their post-secondary K career, then they need to have that information, that knowledge about what's coming next. What does a 504 look like for you? What does a 504 include? What things do you have in your IEP that we can include in your 504 or should be included in your 504, and what things won't be, and how to get those things, because the transition is very different. But that is part of this conversation. If you have to know what that student or what you are planning to do in order to have that conversation about what is going to happen next. And so it's incredibly important that the 504 transition is part of this process, or the conversation about reasonable accommodations in the workplace are part of this transition process. So teaching those advocacy skills, how to ask for a 504 in a college setting, how to ask for a 504 in a trade school setting, how to ask for reasonable accommodations in a workplace setting. Incredibly important that that happens during the K-12 career. And so that way students are set up for that advocacy and for the, making sure that they're set up for success in whatever they choose to do after their K-12 career. So this is kind of the biggest portion that we're going to talk about for the entirety of this. So it's not going to be everything, but this is a very big portion of it, very important section. Defining disability under 504. So you had an IEP, maybe you had an IEP, or maybe you had a 504 in your K-12 career, and now you're transitioning out of that K-12 career, whether it's to a post-secondary institution, public, private, trade school, or you're going into the workforce. What do you need to know to determine if you still qualify under Section 504 for accommodations in an educational setting or accommodations in a workplace setting? So again, this is that broad class definition that Section 504 has provided. So an individual with a disability, or when we're talking about Section 504 in that K-12 setting, a student with a disability has to have one of the following things. So 3 parameters. There's a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. And we're going to talk about what major life activities are. They have a record of such an impairment. So there's some kind of record of that, right? Documentation of this impairment, or they're regarded as having such an impairment. So they're perceived as having, oh, I thought you had, oh, I assumed you had, oh, you used to have, so I just assumed it continued. And so again, it's that very broad class of individuals with disability. So they have to meet one of these 3 things. Defining disability under the parameters of that physical or mental impairment. What does that mean? And I thought it was really important for me not to kind of summarize this and take this directly from that definition. So I apologize that it's a bit wordy or it's some very specific language, but I think that's really important to see exactly what that language looks like under Section 504. So a physical or mental impairment is a physiological disorder or condition. It can be a cosmetic disfigurement. It can be an anatomical loss that affects one or more of the following systems. So your neurological system, your musculoskeletal system, that's a hard word to say, your special sense organs, your respiratory organs, including your speech organs. It can be a cardiovascular issue. It can be a reproductive issue, a digestive issue, a genitourinary issue, hemic and lymphatic systems, skin and endocrine systems. So that's really kind of your whole body from head to toe is covered there. There isn't anything that's left out. So they very specifically have stated all of these things impact how you define a disability, what a disability is, what it looks like, right? So I try to stay away from those broad class words. I apologize if I'm correcting myself. But people have a tendency to assume that somebody has a disability based on the way that they look. Well, or they don't have a disability based on the way that they look. So if they're not in a wheelchair, if they're not on crutches, if it's not incredibly blatantly obvious, others will sometimes say, well, you don't really have a disability, or there's nothing wrong with you, or you're fine, or you're taking advantage. And so the way the law is designed, it's that broad class on purpose. And so it's designed like that on purpose. And it doesn't list specific diseases like diabetes or seizures or muscular dystrophy or PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome. It doesn't list those things for a reason, because it's intended to be that broad class. It's intended to encompass all of these things, again, from head to toe, so that you can identify the disability that you have and what class that fits into, without it being limiting by saying, okay, well, that wasn't included in this list, so therefore that person is excluded. So it's intended to be inclusive, not exclusive. And so those are the physical pieces, and then the mental pieces are those psychological disorders that impact, or psychological disorders, not diagnoses that impact the major life activities. And so major life activities are activities that a person does, like hearing, speaking, lifting, your functions such as breathing or thinking. And this is actually the list that's referenced. And so again, it's intended to be inclusive, not exclusive. So we don't want to exclude anyone. And if this list is new to you, take a second to look at some of the things on here that maybe you didn't think were considered disabilities. So some of them are kind of obvious, right? Caring for oneself. So if you can do those activities of daily living, like dressing, eating, walking, right? So some of those are more obvious than others. So caring for yourself, performing those manual tasks that you need to do, seeing, hearing, eating, sleeping is uncommon. Most people don't think of that when they think of a disability. Walking, standing, lifting, bending. Those are some of the physical mobility disabilities, or things that are impacted as a result of a disability. Breathing, learning, reading, concentrating, thinking, communicating, and working. So again, try to identify one of these that you didn't think about as being a disability, that you didn't think about being impacted by a disability. So major bodily functions, like bowels, bladder, cell growth, your immune system, your endocrine system, like your thyroid, your pancreas, your reproductive system, right? So all of those systems that we mentioned before, those physiological, those medical body, right? Your head to toe. All of those things are major life activities. And so while they're not specifically listed here, this list doesn't include like going to the bathroom, those kinds of things. They're still part of this list. Again, it's designed to be inclusive, not exclusive. And so if you have a disability that significantly impacts your major life activities, one of these major life activities or something similar to one of these major life activities, then you can be identified as a person with disability under Section 504. And these things are normally determined on a case-by-case basis. So again, it's designed to be a broad class, but these things are obviously determined based on that individual person. So is that person's major life activity impacted? Mitigating measures cannot be considered to determine the impact of the impairment. Well, what does that mean? That means that if somebody with a disability, a physical mobility impairment, uses a wheelchair, they are not then considered a person without a disability. They still have that disability, even if the wheelchair gives them mobility. A person who needs a prosthetic is still a person with a disability, even when they're wearing their prosthetic. A person who has ADHD and takes medication for that is still a person with a disability, even when they're taking their medication and their medication works. So under the law, you cannot say, well, this person has this mitigating measure, this person has this mobility device, this person takes that medication, therefore they don't qualify. They don't need a reasonable accommodation. They don't need a 504 plan because they have medication or they have a wheelchair or they've learned how to cope with it. That's another one. Just because you have the ability to cope with the impact of your disability does not mean you don't have a disability. When we see students who have ADHD and we say, well, they've developed good coping skills, they just have to study harder or study longer. They just have to. Those things are not mitigating measures, and they do not make them a person without a disability. They still have a right under Section 504 to access the accommodations that help to kind of level that playing field, to make it easier to access the education or the work environment so they can be productive in their learning or productive in their employment. So it's really important that we understand that those mitigating measures do not make them a person without a disability. They are still a person with a disability, even if something helps them with that. And that kind of goes back to that inalienable piece, right? So things you cannot change about yourself. You are still that person, even with that extra device or that extra support, you are still the person with disabilities. And so it's really important that we can talk about how those accommodations like a wheelchair or ADHD medication or diabetes medication or cardiovascular medication improve the ability to access different arenas of life, but it's still really important to acknowledge that person as a person with a disability who still needs supports, including having learned how to cope with it. So that's one that I hear quite frequently. Well, they learned how to deal with it. That's great that they learned how to deal with it. We can help to alleviate some of the stress of dealing with it by providing the reasonable accommodations and acknowledging that they still need those reasonable accommodations so they can access similar to non-disabled people. So let's talk about how to know if you qualify. How do you know if you qualify for or qualify under Section 504? So one of the things that I hear quite frequently in my own personal life, I heard just recently that a student didn't qualify. My stepson didn't qualify because his grades were too good, because it wasn't impacting him, his grades. And they failed to look at the other pieces of that. So how are the other parts of his education being impacted by the disability that he has? And are they, meeting his needs as a result of that disability, or the things that he needs as a result? One of the things that I hear most common is, well, they have good grades, especially for college students. Well, they have good grades, right? And so that goes back to that coping piece. They've developed the ability to cope. They've developed the ability to cope. And I'm saying that again intentionally because I want there to be that understanding of developing the ability to cope. Learning the behaviors to cope does not mean you no longer have a disability, does not mean you've been cured or you've been fixed, right? Those aren't words that we care to use because they're untrue. They don't need to be fixed. They don't need to be cured. They don't need to be any of those things. What needs to happen is we need to accept that individuals with disabilities need accommodations, deserve accommodations, have a right to those accommodations so that they can have the same or similar access to people who don't have disabilities. So having good grades, having good study habits, working really hard to maintain good grades and study habits doesn't mean you don't qualify. You must consider an agency, or you must consider how the disability impacts that access to education, that access to the work productivity, that access to the job. How does it impact the access? That's how you determine if they qualify. Do they meet those previous criteria we talked about, right? They have a disability, they have a record of the disability, they are perceived as having a disability, and that disability impacts a major life activity. That's how you know if you qualify. And so after it's determined that they meet all those criteria, then you have to determine, okay, well, what is needed to provide that access? How do we provide that access? What is necessary for it to occur? For that student to access the education, for that student to access the materials, for that student to access the social experiences of school or trade school, or for that employee to be able to access productivity, because employees want to be productivity and employers want, or productive, and employers want their employees to be productive. So what needs to happen to make sure that that is accessible? So when we're talking about post-secondary education, so after the K-12 career, how do you get Section 504 services in post-secondary education? So it doesn't look the same at every post-secondary education institution, community colleges, four-year colleges, trade schools. It doesn't look the same everywhere. A lot of times they have something called a Disability Resource Center, and it's not, sometimes they're called disability service organizations or disability services. It might have a different name at your institution. It might be called something completely and entirely, but that's the major function of it. So it's a disability resource center. And you can find these at public institutions and private institutions. And there should be a coordinator at a trade school. Sometimes at a smaller institution, they'll just have a coordinator. And so whoever is at that resource center should be able to tell you who the coordinator is or how to implement your 504 at their institution. But there should be somebody there who knows how to do that. So most often you're going to want to find a disability resource or disability service center, and they're going to be able to provide you with that information about who their coordinator is. Once you know who the coordinator is, you're going to look at developing that 504 plan. And again, we're talking post-secondary education institutions. So higher education institutions, just specifically for this. You're going to want to find that coordinator and talk to them about what your 504 plan looks like, what kind of things you need in your 504 plan. They're going to help you implement that 50 or develop that 504 plan and then implement that 504 plan. They're going to tell you exactly what it looks like in that institution. So if you're needing extra time for an assessment, maybe they offer that in a specific area, or if you're needing a separate place to take that test. They're also going to communicate that information with your instructors. So then they'll instruct you to share that information with instructors to advocate for yourself. But they're also going to share that information with instructors to make sure, if they're the coordinator, that that information is being shared. And that's the place where you're going to go kind of check in, say, hey, this is what I need. Let's talk about how we can do that, what it looks like here. And when I say what it looks like here, I don't mean that they're going to say, okay, well, we just don't do that here. But it may look a little bit different at each institution, how they provide a specific accommodation. And that's really going to vary based on the location of that institution and what type of course it is. And there's a bunch of different factors that go into that, but it's going to look a little bit different. And so you're really going to want to make sure that you're getting with those disability resource centers and you're talking about what those accommodations are, how that 504 plan will work for you there, and how it's going to be implemented. Also ask the question, what happens if an instructor or a professor chooses not to use my accommodations? Because a lot of times it's not a question that's asked, and then people don't know what to do if somebody says, oh no, I'm not going to give you extra time on that, or no, you need to take the test in here with everyone else where I can see you versus taking it in a separate room. And these are just some very broad examples. They're not, you're not limited to this. We're going to talk about what accommodations look like next. But make sure you ask that question. What is the procedure for making sure that my accommodations are implemented? And what do I do if a professor says no? It's really important to ask that question.
Sari, we're running a little short on time, so I want to ask one of the questions that came out to me. They asked, why can't the IEP go with them to college? Why does it need to change to a 504 plan?
Public and private higher education institutions do not fall under the law for IDEA. So a student can have, and I apologize, I guess I thought we had more time. Students, I thought we had a 90 minutes. Did I misunderstand that?
Yeah, it's for an hour. It's from 6:30 to 7:30.
Oh, okay. I apologize. I apologize. I thought it was 90 minutes. So that's my fault. I can send the additional information to others if they would like that, because there's quite a few things that I did not cover that I can try to cover very quickly, or I can send that information out.
So what you could do, no, it's okay. You can just answer the question, and whoever can stay on. That way we have the full presentation to send the link out. So that's fine.
Okay. So the reason for that is those higher education institutions do not fall under the law for IDEA. IDEA covers birth through 21, but only in that public education spectrum, not the higher education spectrum. So if a student is in the K-12 or the pre-K-12 system until they're 21, then they're covered under an IEP. But if they graduate or complete the K-12 system, once they graduate or complete the K-12 system, the IEP has been completed and they can transition to a 504. And those protections change, the law changes from IDEA to ADA or Section 504. They should look very similar when you transition, but again, there are some things that cannot go in a 504 that are in an IEP. So I will continue, and again, my apologies for misunderstanding how much time we have. So an accommodation changes a person's access to the content or to the environment. And so there are 4 basic types of accommodation. So there's a presentation accommodation, which is the access to the way the information is presented. So it's presented in a large print or a braille font, or it's presented orally, or it's presented visual if it's an oral lecture. There are also response accommodations, and response accommodations change just that, how the student is able to respond to a given assignment or prompt. So if it's orally rather than written, if it's in a presentation rather than an essay. So it changes how that information is given back or responded to. Other accommodations include setting, so changing the setting or the place. Setting also includes timing or scheduling, so changing the location, so if you need to be in a separate room, but also changing the timing of the scheduling. So maybe you test better in the morning and your class is at 1 p.m., but really you'd like to take your test at 8 a.m. because you know that's when you do your best. By 1 p.m., you're already done for the day, and cognitively your thinking is impacted. Or the amount of time that's allowed. So you need twice as much time, or you need 50% more time than others. That is also included in that. And those are the 4 basic types of accommodations. They kind of all fall into that in one way or another. And so they don't all look the same. They kind of all fall into those 4 categories. So when we're talking about that transition to the workforce, as I mentioned earlier, some people are going to be collaboratively in their K-12 career and in the workforce, or in their higher education career and in the workforce as well. So as long as you're in the workforce, these will apply. And reasonable accommodation under ADA or Section 504, because that became ADA, is a modification or an adjustment to the job itself, the work environment, or the way that things are usually done in the hiring process. And again, this is directly that law, just so you know what that language is, so you're familiar with it. There's an exception to that, and that is that undue hardship piece. And so if something is creating an undue hardship for the employer, it's something that's significantly difficult for the employer to do or change. It causes a significant expense for the employer. It's extensive, substantial, or significantly disruptive to the employer or the production of the employer's business, or it fundamentally alters the nature of the operation of the business. So that is the only exception in which an employer is allowed to say, I'm unable to provide you this reasonable accommodation. So reasonable accommodations ensure that there's equal opportunity in the hiring process. So going back to that anti-discrimination piece, right? So not being able to discriminate based on a disability. It enables a otherwise qualified individual with a disability to perform the essential functions of the job. You must be able to perform the essential function of the job with a reasonable accommodation in order to qualify for the job. So that's where that qualified piece comes in. If there's a reasonable accommodation, you still must be able to perform the essential functions of the job without it being altered. It makes it possible for employees with disability to access equal benefits and the privileges of employment. So having gainful employment and being productive in their employment. Reasonable accommodations do not change those essential job functions. So you still have to, as an employee, be able to complete the essential job function. It does not create a new job. They cannot say, okay, well, you don't meet those essential, you can't perform those essential job functions. We're going to create this new position over here for you, or we're required to create a new position over here for you. They voluntarily want to do that, they're welcome to, but they can't be required to. And it's not providing personal items, things you would need, prosthetics or glasses or whatever to mitigate they don't have to provide those mitigating measures to help you access the job. Some examples, like physical changes to locations, include ramps or accessible restrooms or workspace layouts. So widening the spaces between desks. If you've ever gone into a store and you're walking through the aisles kind of like this, or you're walking through clothing racks, and it can't really fit. Imagine what that is like for somebody who has mobility issues, has a wheelchair that they need to navigate in a small space, or has crutches that they don't want to catch on things like, desks or cords laying on the floor and things like that. So those are reasonable accommodations that should be taking place in that workplace environment. And this is not an exhaustive list of any of these reasonable accommodations, it's just some examples. Also includes accessibility and assistive technologies, so software that reads the screen, or speech to text, or TTY devices, video phones, or other things that help individuals who are hearing impaired or vision impaired to be able to access the job functions. Accessibility communications, things like sign language interpreters, closed captions on any kind of training or devices. I think at the beginning of this, we added closed captions to this recording, which I'm very excited about. It's one of my favorite accessibility features. I use it all the time, and really supports me individually. Braille for those individuals who need it and can read it, and things like large print text are other examples of reasonable accommodations. Policy enhancements, things like adjusting work policies to allow service animals, and adjusting work schedules or location. So say an individual has a significant medical need and they're unable to, if it doesn't change the essential job function or meet any of those other criteria for undue hardship, it may be an option to adjust the work schedule so it's after medical appointments, or the work location so that maybe that person is allowed to work remotely, or a location that's closer to their home so their transportation is shorter, different things like that. But those adjustments to the policy that's existing can be reasonable accommodations. And there are very specific rules and guidance around service animals as well. I won't go into that, but if it's something that you're interested in, there's definitely a lot of information out there, and I'll try to answer any questions I can. So how do you get a reasonable accommodation? The law says that you have a duty to make the request. So the employer does not have to offer it to you. You have to make the request. You have to meet the definition that we discussed as a person with a disability. You have to ask for it. You can ask for it verbally. You can also ask for it in writing. You do not have to do both, although an employer might say, hey, can you put that request in writing and, so I know specifically what you need. That's acceptable. They cannot deny the verbal request, but they could ask for additional information in writing. They can ask for reasonable documentation if the disability isn't obvious. So if your disability isn't something that they already are aware of or is not obvious to them, they can ask for reasonable documentation. Does not include things like medical records or specific diagnosis information. It might just be a letter that indicates that yes, this person has a disability. Again, doesn't need to include a diagnosis, and requires reasonable accommodations. So reasonable documentation can be requested. And again, it needs to be reasonable and non-invasive and cannot violate privacy or HIPAA laws. If you have more questions about that, definitely that's more of a legal question. So consult your HR or consult an attorney. The request does not need to specifically reference the word reasonable accommodation or the Americans with Disabilities Act. So you don't have to say like, well, this is an ADA request, or this is a reasonable accommodation under the law. You just have to make the request for the reasonable accommodation. So some violations, again, this is not an exhaustive list. This is just some examples. So it's a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act if somebody denies you a reasonable accommodation and you otherwise qualify, if they fail to implement the reasonable accommodation, or if they request unnecessary documentation. So again, those components of it needing to be reasonable request for documentation. So is that disability obvious and they're still asking for documentation, or you've already previously provided enough information and they're making a request for more information for some reason that is unreasonable. One of the things that I wanted to touch on before we end the call is Schedule A hiring. So the government has a program called provision called Schedule A hiring. And what it says is that the government can provide employment preference. And I use that word loosely. It has to do with being otherwise qualified as a candidate, being able to perform the central job functions, et cetera. But they can provide a preference for individuals who have an intellectual disability, severe physical or psychiatric disability, and I apologize. And that requires like documentation from a licensed medical professional or a licensed vocational rehabilitation specialist. And that can come from a number of different sources. There's lots of information out there on kind of what that process looks like, but I wanted to make sure as part of this, I shared that there are some other things in place for preference for hiring individuals who have disabilities. And so these are just some examples of what those letters might look like. It doesn't include any diagnosis information. It just is a letter on letterhead from a licensed medical or licensed vocational rehab professional. And it just says this person has a disability identified and references the law, the statute, and needs an accommodation or is eligible for Schedule A hiring. So that's kind of what those look like and how you can utilize that information. You can utilize that for hiring within the government. So quickly, I will talk about dispute resolution, just some options that are available to you. If we're talking about IDEA and special education services and IEPs, that is through the U.S. Department of Education or the State Department of Education, and the Office of Special Education Services. So you'd want to utilize those avenues for dispute resolution processes, whether it's state complaints, mediation, or if you're filing with the Office of Special Education in the U.S. Department of Education, you would use that for IEPs. If you're looking at Section 504 violations, whether it's in the K-12 arena or otherwise, there's some idiosyncrasies there. I won't get too much into that. If you have specific questions, feel free to ask. But those would all be directed through the Office of Civil Rights. If you're looking at workplace violations, you'd also be looking at the Office of Civil Rights or your local ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, to support you with any of those kinds of dispute resolution pieces. And so again, just the law, the anti-discrimination law, you have the right to be free from discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, national origin, age, disability, marital status, and political affiliation. And I did that really fast because I apologize. I didn't realize that we were out of time, but I will answer questions if anybody's still here and wants their questions answered.
If anyone has a question, you can send it directly to me, or you can put it in the chat for everyone to see. I don't see any more questions to me. I just see some thank yous to people that had to leave early. Yeah, everyone's just saying thank you for their presentation. I had to leave early and asking me to send them the link.
And I apologize for that. I really thought that it said a 90-minute time limit. And so I really apologize. That's 100% my fault for missing that.
It's okay. Eric, if you want to stop the recording, we can. It's not a problem. I did want you to finish though. That's why I just said just keep going, and who can stay on can stay on. So you see, we still have people that stayed on, so you are fine. If anyone does have a question, we do have a few minutes left if you want to ask a question. Otherwise, we'll just email you guys the link so that you can go back and review it. Thank you, EI or EL. I'm not sure which one it is. But I want to make sure. I guess we're good. No one else is saying anything. So thank you all for coming tonight. We do have another event next month, so I'll get that out to you guys shortly. Thank you to our presenter, Sari, for coming to talk to us about ADA. Oh, Essence Presley. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Eric, from our IT department that came to support us as well, and our board members and everyone that came to join. Everyone have a lovely night, and we'll see you next month at our next event.